The lights inside the massive hall were so bright they made everything look like a dream. The ceiling was high and decorated with thousands of tiny crystals that sparkled like stars. Down below, the floor was a sea of black and white suits, colorful dresses, and champagne glasses that caught the light. It was one of the biggest nights of the year in Hollywood, a charity gala meant to help sick children, but for most people there, it was just a place to be seen. The air smelled like expensive perfume, flowers, and rich food. It was the kind of place where everyone smiled with their teeth but kept their eyes cold, scanning the room to see who was more important than whom. Keanu Reeves walked into the room, and he didn't look like he belonged to that fake world. He wore a tuxedo, but it didn't look brand new or overly tight. It looked comfortable, like a favorite shirt he actually enjoyed wearing. He didn't have a big group of bodyguards pushing people out of the way. In fact, he was almost alone. He walked with his head down a little, not out of shyness, but because he was watching his step. He moved carefully, as if he was afraid of bumping into someone or knocking over a tray of drinks. When people recognized him, their eyes went wide. They would lean in and whisper, "Is that him?" But Keanu just kept moving toward the side of the room, looking for a quiet spot. Across the room, standing near a tall pillar wrapped in white silk, was a young man named Ben. Ben was not like the others. His suit was black, but if you looked closely, you could see it was a little shiny at the elbows, a sign that it had been worn too many times or maybe bought secondhand. He held a glass of something strong in his hand, and his knuckles were white from gripping it so hard. Ben had been in Lowe's Angels for 5 years. He had come to the city with big dreams of being a star, just like the man walking across the floor. But Ben's dreams had turned into dust. Ben watched Keanu move through the crowd. He saw how people reached out to touch Keanu's arm, how they laughed too loud at things he hadn't even said yet. To Ben, it looked like a sickness. He saw Keanu stop to shake hands with an older man in a wheelchair, bending down to talk to him at eye level. Most people would have just bent at the waist and kept walking, but Keanu squatted down on his heels. He listened. He smiled a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "He's faking it," Ben muttered to himself. He took a long drink from his glass. The liquid burned his throat, but he didn't care. It's all an act. Nobody is that nice. It's just a PR stunt. Ben's heart was beating fast, but not from excitement. It was beating with a heavy, hot rhythm that felt like anger. He thought about his own life. He thought about the small, hot apartment he shared with 2 roommates. He thought about the casting directors who never looked up from their phones when he auditioned. He thought about the debt collector who had called him that morning. He looked at Keanu, who seemed to float above all those problems, and a dark feeling grew inside Ben's chest. It wasn't just jealousy, it was a deep sense of unfairness. Why him? Why did Keanu get everything when guys like Ben got nothing? The room was getting louder. The music had switched from smooth jazz to something with a heavier beat, and people were talking louder to be heard over it. Waiters weaved through the crowd with silver trays. Keanu, having finished speaking to the man in the wheelchair, moved toward the edge of the dance floor. He looked a bit tired now. The energy of the room seemed to drain him. He spotted a waiter standing by a wall who looked exhausted. The waiter was an older man with gray hair and a stoop in his back. He was wiping a sweat from his forehead with a napkin. Keanu walked over to him. He didn't ask for a drink, he just stood there for a second. "Long night?" Keanu asked. His voice was soft, but it was kind. The waiter looked up, startled that a guest was speaking to him like a human being. "Yes, sir. Very busy, but it is for a good cause." Keanu nodded. "You're doing a great job, really. I see you running back and forth. Take a breath if you can." The waiter's face changed. He didn't just look polite anymore, he looked genuinely touched. "Thank you, sir." "Thank you." Ben saw this whole thing happen from his spot by the pillar. He saw the way Keanu leaned in, the way he treated the waiter like a friend. But in Ben's mind, twisted by alcohol and years of rejection, it looked different. He saw a rich, famous actor acting like a saint. It made him feel small. It made him feel invisible. If Keanu was so good, why was the world still so hard for people like Ben? It felt like a slap in the face just to watch it. "He thinks he's better than everyone," Ben whispered. The anger was rising up in him like a wave. He felt his face getting hot. He couldn't stand there and watch the perfect Keanu Reeves be the hero of the story one more time. Ben wanted to break that image. He wanted to show everyone that the emperor wasn't wearing any clothes, even if he had to rip them off himself. He pushed himself away from the pillar. He didn't care that he almost bumped into a woman in a sparkling blue dress. She shot him a dirty look, but he didn't even see her. His eyes were locked on Keanu. The crowd between them was thick, a wall of expensive fabric and laughter. But Ben started to push through. He was rougher than he should have been. He elbowed a man in a gray suit, spilling a bit of his own drink on the floor. "Hey, watch it!" someone snapped. Ben didn't stop. He was moving like a shark that had smelled blood in the water. His mind was racing with thoughts of everything he had lost. The auditions, the money, the respect. And here was this man, this stranger, who had it all and was acting like it was no big deal. It wasn't fair, it just wasn't fair. Keanu was still standing near the waiter, saying something quiet that made the old man chuckle. He had no idea what was coming. He had no idea that a storm was brewing just a few feet away. The rest of the room was still glittering and happy, unaware that the mood was about to snap. Ben took one last swallow of his drink, leaving the glass on a random table as he passed. He smoothed the front of his rented jacket. He didn't look like a threat yet. He just looked like another guest. But his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer force of the rage boiling inside him. He was closing the distance, step by step, and the silence in his own head was louder than the music. The distance between the pillar and the edge of the dance floor wasn't far, but for Ben, it felt like walking a tightrope over a deep canyon. Every step he took was heavy, his feet dragging slightly on the expensive carpet. The music in the room was loud, a rhythmic thump that vibrated in his chest, but the sound in his own head was much louder. It was a chaotic mix of his own heartbeat and a voice screaming that he had to do this. He had to break the spell. He was sweating now, not just from the heat of the crowded room, but from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. As he got closer, the details of the scene became sharper. He could see the texture of the waiter's uniform, the loose thread on the older man's shoulder. He could see the way Keanu stood, relaxed, with one hand in his pocket, nodding politely at something the waiter said. Keanu looked peaceful. That peace was like a red rag to a bull for Ben. It felt mocking. How could he be so calm when the world was burning? How could he smile so easily when Ben felt like he was drowning every single day? Ben was now just a few feet away. The guests around him were still chatting and laughing, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. A woman in a long green dress brushed past Ben, giving him an annoyed look because he wasn't moving fast enough. She didn't see the wild look in his eyes. She didn't see that he was a coiled spring ready to snap. "Excuse me," Ben said, but his voice came out as a croak. No one heard him. He took the final step. He was standing right behind Keanu. The actor smelled like clean laundry and something subtle like sandalwood. It was a calming smell, but it only made Ben angrier. He wanted to ruin that calm. He wanted to shatter the picture-perfect moment that everyone else was admiring from afar. Keanu must have sensed a presence behind him, a shadow that didn't belong to the flow of the party. He turned around slowly. He didn't look annoyed or guarded. He just turned, his face open, expecting maybe a fan or an old friend. "Hi there," Keanu said softly. He gave a small, polite nod. "How are you doing tonight?" Ben stared at him. For a second, the words caught in his throat. Up close, Keanu's eyes were kind. There was no arrogance there, no looking down on him. That was the hardest part. If Keanu had looked like a jerk, it would have been easy to hit him. But looking into those kind eyes, Ben felt a moment of hesitation. But then, the alcohol in his system and the years of rejection pushed that hesitation away. He convinced himself that the kindness was just a mask, a better mask than most people wore, but a mask nonetheless. "You think you're so special," Ben said. His voice was louder than he intended. It cracked a little. The waiter, sensing trouble, took a small step back, clutching his towel tighter. Keanu didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly, trying to understand what was happening. "I'm sorry," Keanu asked gently. "Is everything okay? Don't talk to me like that," Ben shouted. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the gala like a knife. People nearby stopped talking. They turned their heads. A hush started to ripple outward from the center of the room where they stood. "You think you're better than us," Ben continued, his voice rising to a scream now. "You walk around like you're a saint, like you care about people. It's all fake. It's all for the cameras." Keanu looked at the young man. He saw the trembling hands. He saw the tears welling up in the corners of Ben's eyes. He didn't see an enemy. He saw someone who was in pain. Keanu took a small step forward, his hands coming up slowly, palms open in a non-threatening way. "Hey," Keanu said, his voice low and soothing. "Take it easy. Nobody is better than anybody. Breathe, man, just breathe." To anyone watching, it looked like Keanu was trying to handle a volatile situation with grace. But to Ben, that soothing tone felt like poison. It felt like pity. It felt like the most famous actor in the world was patronizing him, treating him like a child throwing a tantrum. Ben's vision blurred with tears of rage. He felt trapped. He felt like the whole room was laughing at him, even though they were just staring in shock. "I don't need you to tell me to breathe," Ben yelled. He swung his arm wildly, knocking a small vase off a nearby table. It shattered on the floor, the sound sharp and terrifying. The silence in the room was absolute now. The band had stopped playing. Everyone was looking. Waiters froze in place. Security guards in black suits were starting to push their way through the crowd, but they were still too far away to stop what happened next. Ben's chest was heaving. He looked at Keanu, who was standing there, calm and solid. Ben felt like he had to do something to break that solidity. He had to make a mark. He felt a sudden, explosive urge to lash out, to hurt something beautiful because he felt so ugly inside. Without thinking, without planning it, Ben pulled his arm back. His hand was clenched into a tight fist, but at the last second it opened. He didn't want to punch him, he wanted to slap him. He wanted to insult him, not just injure him. The slap echoed through the hall. It was a sickening, sharp sound, asterisk, thwack, asterisk. Keanu's head snapped to the side. The force of it made him stumble back a step, his shoe catching on the carpet. He didn't fall, but he looked unsteady for a moment. His hand went up to his cheek, covering the spot where the blow had landed. The room was so quiet that you could hear the hum of the lights overhead. The waiter gasped, a sharp intake of breath. A woman near the front covered her mouth with her hand. Ben stood there, his arm still hanging in the air, his hand stinging from the impact. The rage that had fueled him for the last 10 minutes suddenly evaporated, leaving him cold and empty. He looked at his own hand as if it belonged to someone else. He looked at Keanu, who was slowly turning his face back to look at him. Keanu didn't fight back. He didn't shout. He didn't even look angry. He just looked shocked. His cheek was already turning a bright red. There was a mark on his face, a physical sign of the violence that had just occurred. For a moment that felt like an hour, nobody moved. Ben felt the reality of what he had done crash down on him. He had just hit Keanu Reeves. He had just assaulted a man in front of hundreds of witnesses. His career, which was already hanging by a thread, was gone. His life was over. The panic started to rise in his throat, tasting like bile. He looked around and saw the security guards finally breaking through the circle of guests. They looked serious, their faces hard. "Hey," one of the guards shouted, grabbing Ben by the shoulder roughly. "Get on the ground." Ben didn't resist. He let his arms go limp. The tears that had been threatening to spill finally broke free, running down his face. He wasn't angry anymore. He was just terrified and small. He looked back at Keanu, searching for hate, searching for anger, hoping that Keanu would yell at him, would do something to justify what Ben had done. But Keanu was just standing there, holding his cheek, looking at Ben with a confusion that was heartbreaking to witness. It was the look of someone trying to understand why they had been hurt, when all they had offered was kindness. The air in the room was thick with tension, waiting for the next move, waiting to see if this would turn into a brawl or a tragedy. The silence that followed the slap was heavy and suffocating. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the grand ballroom, leaving a vacuum where the noise and laughter used to be. The only sounds were the ragged breathing of the young man, Ben, and the scuffling of shoes on the carpet as the security guards tightened their grip. Ben's face was pressed awkwardly against his shoulder, his arm twisted behind his back at a sharp angle. He didn't fight them. He couldn't. All the fight had drained out of him the moment his hand made contact with Keanu's face. The guards were big men, broad-shouldered and serious. They were used to dealing with drunk tourists and overzealous fans, but this was different. This was an assault on one of the biggest stars in the world. One of the guards, a man with a tight beard and a headset, leaned in close to Ben's ear. "You're in a lot of trouble, kid," the guard growled. "Don't move a muscle." Ben squeezed his eyes shut. Tears leaked out, running hot down his cheeks and mixing with the sweat on his face. He felt small. He felt like a child who had broken something precious and was waiting for the yelling to start. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew what came next. In his mind, he saw the flashing lights of police cars. He saw himself being handcuffed and paraded past all these beautiful people. He saw his dreams, already fragile, shattering into a million pieces. Everyone in the room was staring. The guests, dressed in their expensive gowns and tailored suits, had formed a wide circle around the commotion. Their faces were masks of shock and curiosity. Some held their phones up, recording the scene, while others just stood with their mouths open. In Hollywood, drama was entertainment, but this was real and raw, and it made everyone uncomfortable. They were waiting for the climax. They were waiting for the star to react. Keanu was still standing near the spot where he had been hit. He had taken a step back to regain his balance, but he hadn't run away. Slowly, he lowered his hand from his cheek. The skin was turning a bright, angry red. It must have stung terribly, a sharp, burning pain, but he didn't rub it. He just looked at his hand for a second, as if checking for blood, and then he looked up at Ben. The expectation in the room was palpable. People expected Keanu to be furious. They expected him to yell. They expected him to point a finger and shout for the police to take this madman away. After all, he had been publicly humiliated. He had been disrespected in front of hundreds of peers. Anyone else in his position would have been screaming for justice. The security guard holding Ben looked over at Keanu, waiting for a signal. "Sir, are you okay?" the guard asked loudly, his voice commanding. "We can take him out the back." "Do you want to press charges? We can have the police here in 2 minutes." The word police hung in the air like a threat. Ben flinched visibly. He kept his head down, staring at the pattern on the carpet, wishing he could disappear into the floor. He didn't look up. He couldn't bear to see the hatred in Keanu's eyes. He was sure that when he finally looked up, he would see pure rage. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the final push. Keanu didn't answer the guard immediately. He looked at the sobbing man being held by the 2 large guards. He saw the way Ben's shoulders were shaking. He saw the cheap suit, the worn shoes, the utter defeat in the young man's posture. The anger that everyone expected to see on Keanu's face never appeared. Instead, his expression softened. It went from shock to something else, something that looked like concern. The room grew restless. The lack of screaming was confusing the guests. They whispered among themselves. "Is he going to do something? Why isn't he fighting back? I can't believe that guy hit him." The guard tightened his grip on Ben's arm, making Ben wince. "Come on, let's get him out of here before he causes more trouble," the guard said to his partner. He started to drag Ben toward the exit. Ben stumbled, his feet catching on the carpet. He let out a small, pathetic sound of fear. He was going to jail. He was going to lose everything. He felt a wave of nausea. This was it. The end of the line. Then a voice cut through the noise. Wait, it wasn't a shout. It was quiet, but it carried authority. Everyone turned to look at Keanu. He took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and the security guards. He raised one hand, palm out, in a stopping motion. "Let him go," Keanu said. The guard froze. He looked confused. He looked at Ben, then back at Keanu. "Sir, he assaulted you." "We need to, please," Keanu interrupted. His voice was gentle but firm. "Let him go. Let him stand up." The guard hesitated for a moment, looking at his partner for guidance. They were trained to protect, but they also worked for the people hosting the event, and Keanu was the guest of honor. Slowly, reluctantly, the guard loosened his grip on Ben's arm. He didn't let go completely, but he stopped dragging him away. Ben straightened up, rubbing his wrist where the guard had held him. He was trembling so hard he thought his knees might buckle. He finally dared to look up. He expected to see Keanu's face twisted in anger. He expected to see a man who wanted revenge. But what he saw stopped his breath. Keanu wasn't looking at him with hate. He was looking at him with a sadness that was profound. It was the kind of look a father might give a son who had made a terrible mistake. It was a look that said, "I see you, and I know you are hurting." The tension in the room was at its breaking point. The air felt thick like before a thunderstorm, but there was no rain outside. The storm was inside the hearts of the people watching. They couldn't understand what was happening. Why wasn't he angry? Where was the outrage? Ben stood there, crying openly now, unable to stop the tears. He felt naked in front of all these people. His ego was gone, stripped away by the violence of his own action and the unexpected kindness of the man he had struck. He waited for the other shoe to drop. He waited for Keanu to say something that would destroy him. But Keanu just stood there, a calm presence in the center of the chaos, holding the power to ruin Ben's life or save it. And the whole world seemed to stop breathing while he decided. The two guards looked at each other, completely lost. They were trained to handle threats, to neutralize danger, and to protect the client at all costs. But this situation didn't fit into any of their manuals. The threat was a crying young man who looked like he couldn't hurt a fly, and the client was telling them to stop. The guard with the headset slowly took his hands off Ben's shoulders, but he didn't step away. He stayed hovering, his muscles tense, ready to jump back in if things went wrong again. Ben stood there, swaying slightly. He rubbed his wrist where the guard had grabbed him, but his eyes were fixed on the carpet. He couldn't lift his head. He felt like the weight of the entire building was pressing down on him. The shame was a physical pain, a hot ball of fire in his stomach. He knew he deserved to be dragged out. He knew he deserved to be arrested. He was waiting for Keanu to yell at him to tell the guards to take him away. But the silence just stretched on, thick and heavy. Keanu took a slow breath. He ignored the hundreds of eyes staring at him. He ignored the whispers that were starting to ripple through the crowd again. He focused entirely on the broken young man in front of him. He stepped closer, closing the small gap that separated them. The guard instinctively moved to block him, but Keanu shook his head slightly. "It's okay," Keanu said, so softly that only the guard and Ben could hear. Keanu reached out. Ben flinched, squeezing his eyes shut, bracing himself for another blow or for Keanu to shove him away. But the hand that landed on his shoulder was gentle. It wasn't a grip of control, it was a grip of support. Keanu's hand felt warm and steady through the thin fabric of Ben's jacket. "Look at me," Keanu said. His voice wasn't angry, it wasn't even loud. It was just a quiet request in the middle of a noisy room. Ben shook his head, tears dripping off his nose onto the floor. "I can't," he choked out. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." "Hey," Keanu said, giving his shoulder a light squeeze. "It's okay, look at me, please." Slowly, painfully, Ben lifted his head. His face was red and blotchy, his eyes swollen. He looked like a mess. When he finally met Keanu's gaze, he expected to see hatred. He expected to see the actor looking at him like garbage. But Keanu's eyes were calm. There was a sadness in them, deep and real, but there was no anger. It was a look that stripped away all the Hollywood glamour and left just two human beings standing on a carpet. "You're hurting," Keanu said. It wasn't a question. He said it like he was stating a fact, like he could see right through Ben's skin and into the chaos underneath. Ben let out a sob that sounded like a hiccup. I tried so hard. And nobody sees me, and you have everything, it's not fair." Keanu nodded. He didn't argue, he didn't defend himself, he just listened. "I know it feels that way," he said. "I know it feels heavy, like you're carrying a boulder up a hill that never ends." Ben stared at him. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had just assaulted this man, and the man was comforting him. It didn't make sense, it broke his brain. "Why aren't you mad?" Ben whispered. "Hit me back, yell at me." "Do something." Keanu shook his head slowly. "Hitting you won't make the weight go away. It'll just make us both hurt." He took his hand off Ben's shoulder and looked at his own hand for a moment, then back at Ben. "We're all just walking through the dark, man. Sometimes we trip. Sometimes we fall, but hurting someone else, it doesn't help you stand up. It just drags them down with you." The room was dead silent. The guests nearby were straining their ears to hear. Some of them had put their phones down, realizing this wasn't a fight they wanted to record anymore. It was something private and fragile happening in a public space. The energy in the room had shifted from excitement to something like reverence. They were watching a masterclass in empathy. "You hit me because you want to be seen," Keanu continued, his voice low and rhythmic. "You want to matter, but this—" He gestured vaguely to Ben's trembling hands. "This isn't how you matter. You matter because you're here, you matter because you have a voice. Don't waste it on anger, don't waste it on me." Ben was crying hard now, but it was different than before. It wasn't the angry tears of a few minutes ago. It was a release. The rage that had been bottled up inside him for years was pouring out, leaving him drained. He felt like a child who had finally been caught after doing something wrong, only to find out that he wasn't going to be punished, but understood. It was a strange feeling, almost unfamiliar, to be treated with kindness when he deserved the opposite. Keanu reached into his pocket. Ben flinched again, thinking he was pulling out a phone to call the police. But Keanu pulled out a clean, white handkerchief. He held it out to Ben. "Here," Keanu said. "Clean your face." Ben took the cloth with a shaking hand. He wiped his eyes and blew his nose. He felt small, but in a different way now. He felt small because he was in the presence of someone who was actually big, not because of fame or money, but because of the size of his heart. Am I? Am I going to jail?" Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper. The fear was still there, lurking under the tears. Keanu looked at the guards. He looked at the manager of the event, who was rushing over with a frantic look on his face. Then he looked back at Ben. "No," Keanu said clearly. "No police. No charges." The manager arrived, breathless. "Mr. Reeves, we have to call the police. This is an assault. We need to press charges or the insurance won't." Keanu turned to the manager. He wasn't rude, but his voice left no room for argument. "No charges. He's not a criminal. He's just a guy who had a really bad night." "We're letting it go." The manager opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Ben, who was clutching the handkerchief, and then back at Keanu. Finally, the manager nodded slowly and stepped back. Keanu turned his attention back to Ben. "Go home," he said gently. "Get some sleep, wake up tomorrow, and start over. Just don't hit people, okay?" "It's not a good way to get attention." Ben nodded frantically. "I won't, I promise, I swear." "Okay," Keanu said. He patted Ben on the shoulder one last time, a firm, solid gesture that seemed to anchor Ben to the ground. "Take care of yourself." Ben stood there for a moment, clutching the handkerchief. He looked at Keanu, wanting to say thank you, but his throat was too tight to speak. He took a shaky step backward, then another. The guards watched him closely, but they didn't touch him. Ben turned and stumbled away, not running, but walking quickly toward the edge of the room. He didn't look back at the crowd. He just wanted to get out, to breathe air that didn't smell like champagne and guilt. As he moved away, the crowd parted for him, not with judgment this time, but with a strange, quiet respect. They had come to see a movie star, but they had witnessed a human being do something extraordinary. The silence held for a long time after Ben left, hanging over the room like a blessing. The quiet that filled the ballroom after Ben left was different from the silence before. Before, it had been a tense silence, full of shock and fear. Now it was a heavy, thoughtful silence. It was the kind of quiet that happens when something truly real breaks through the fake surface of a party. People slowly lowered their phones. The red lights on the cameras flickered off. No one wanted to record this anymore because it felt too private, too sacred to share with the internet. Keanu stood alone in the center of the circle for a moment. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly. The red mark on his cheek was still visible, a stark contrast against his pale skin. It must have hurt, but he didn't touch it again. He just looked at the empty space where the young man had been standing. There was a look of exhaustion on his face, not physical tiredness, but a deep weariness that comes from carrying the weight of other people's pain. The event manager rushed over, looking flustered and apologetic. He was holding a clipboard like a shield. "Mr. Reeves, I am so sorry. That was terrible. Security is usually much tighter." "Are you sure you don't want us to call the police? We can still catch him." Keanu looked at the manager. His eyes were gentle, but he shook his head firmly. "No," he said. "It's over. Let him go." "He's just hurting." "But he hit you," the manager insisted, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "We have to do something." Keanu managed a small, tired smile. "We did do something. We let him go. That's enough." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't want to make a speech or be the center of attention anymore. The magic of the night, the sparkle of the gala, had faded for him. He turned and began to walk away from the dance floor. He didn't head for the main exit where the photographers were waiting outside like hungry wolves. He knew they would want to ask questions about the slap, about the scandal. He didn't have the energy for that. Instead, he walked toward the side of the room, looking for a way out that offered peace. As he moved through the crowd, the atmosphere shifted. People didn't swarm him. They didn't ask for selfies. They actually stepped back, giving him space. It was a sign of respect that was deeper than the usual celebrity worship. They had seen something real tonight, and they treated him with a kind of reverence. He passed the older waiter he had spoken to earlier. The man was standing by a pillar, looking a little shaken. Keanu stopped in front of him. The waiter looked up, worry in his eyes. "Are you all right, sir?" the waiter asked softly. "I'm okay," Keanu replied. He reached out and gently patted the older man on the arm. "Are you okay? That must have been scary." The waiter nodded, his eyes glistening a little. "I am fine now. You are a good man, Mr. Reeves." "A good man?" Keanu didn't argue, he just nodded once. "Thank you, take care of yourself." He continued walking until he found a glass sliding door that led out to a quiet terrace. It wasn't a grand entrance, just a simple exit for staff or smokers. He pushed the door open and stepped outside. The air was cool and crisp. It felt clean compared to the heavy, perfumed air inside. He was alone for the first time in hours. He leaned against the stone railing of the terrace and looked out at the city lights in the distance. The music from the gala was muffled here, just a soft thumping in the background. He finally brought his hand up to his face. His fingertips brushed the sore spot on his cheek. It was tender and hot. He winced slightly. He was human after all. The violence had hurt him physically, just as it had hurt him emotionally to see someone in so much pain. But as he stood there in the dark, he didn't feel anger toward Ben. He just hoped the young man would find his way. A black car pulled up quietly on the street below the terrace. It wasn't a limousine. It was a simple, comfortable sedan. His driver waited by the open door. Keanu took one last breath of the night air and headed down the stairs. He got into the back seat, sinking into the leather upholstery. "Home, sir?" the driver asked. "Yes, please," Keanu said. "Just take me home." As the car pulled away from the venue, merging into the flow of traffic, the Hollywood Gala continued without him. But inside the ballroom, everything had changed. The guests didn't go back to their shallow chatter immediately. They talked about what they had seen. They didn't gossip about Ben as a villain or Keanu as a victim. They talked about the forgiveness. For the rest of the night, people acted differently. They were nicer to the waiters. They listened more to each other. They smiled real smiles. The slap had shattered the illusion of the perfect Hollywood night, but in its place, something more honest had appeared. It was a reminder that everyone, no matter how famous or how rich, was just a person trying to navigate a difficult world. The story didn't appear in the tabloids the next day as a scandal. There were no headlines screaming, "Keanu attacked," because there were no police reports and no angry statements. Instead, the story spread through whispers and text messages. It became a legend among the people who were there. They told their friends, and their friends told others. They told the story of the night. The biggest star in the room showed that true strength isn't about hitting back. It's about having the power to destroy someone and choosing to save them instead. Weeks later, Ben was walking down a different street. He wasn't at a gala. He was on his way to a job interview at a small coffee shop. He didn't have much, but he had a clean shirt and a clear head. He still thought about that night often. Every time he felt the anger rising, every time he felt like the world was against him, he would remember the handkerchief in his pocket, a white, square cloth that he had washed and kept. He would remember the man who didn't fight back, and the anger would cool down, replaced by a determination to be better. He had been stunned that night, not by the slap he gave, but by the grace he received, and it changed him slowly, one day at a time.